Amendments to the US Constitution. Now, amendments were always intended. When the Constitution was originally written, they knew that it would need to be changed. Firstly, because they knew they wanted to put a Bill of Rights in there. They couldn't yet agree what these rights were going to be, but they wanted to get the Constitution done and out and ratified and up and running. And so part of the Constitution itself, Article 5, talks about how you amend it, how you change it, how you add to it. It's a key part of the Constitution, is the ability to amend it, to keep it up to date. So the Constitution was never ever intended to be an unchanging document. It was intended to be updated as it needs to be. Now, the Constitution hasn't been updated very many times, 27 times in about 300 years. Now, is that a lot or a little? You could probably argue it both ways, but if you think about the amount of constitutional changes Britain has had over that same period, you could probably argue it's a relatively small amount. But I would suggest you do some additional reading and make that decision yourself. I've given you some interesting links here. Of course, you've got the revision guides, the textbook, and the link there, which you can find in the PowerPoint, will give you an interesting article that talks about the kind of narrative of changes and why they happen. Now, what exactly is an amendment? I've said it's when you change the Constitution, but let's be a little bit more specific. It could be when you add something to the Constitution, like the Bill of Rights. That was 10 additional points that were added to the Constitution that weren't there before. It could be where you take a particular line and you adjust it or you tweak it. So, for example, when when women were allowed to kind of vote as well, it kind of changed the Constitution from allowing men to vote to allowing women to vote as well. It's an adjustment to the Constitution. Or you could take something that's in there and you can pull it out completely. So that symbol there represents alcohol. There was a constitutional amendment that said, it was called prohibition, that said you can't have alcohol, but then it didn't work. It didn't work out. It was probably one of the biggest failures they've ever done in terms of constitutional amendments, and so they then had to take the whole thing out. So that's what an amendment is. Now, I would strongly suggest that you do a bit of extra research, just 10 minutes, 15 minutes, have a look around. Google something like, what's your favorite constitutional amendment? Or my favorite constitutional amendment, something like that, and you'll find some interesting links where people kind of rate them against one up against the other. Firstly, it'll be good for you because you'll learn what some of the amendments are, but secondly, you'll also learn about some of the impact that some of these amendments have had and how they have changed America or not. So suggestion there for a bit of additional research, Google that. So how do you actually amend the Constitution? Now remember, it says in the Constitution how you amend the Constitution. So it's not an accident and it's not up for debate and it hasn't changed. So they haven't changed how you change the Constitution. There's actually 4 different ways you can do this, but by far there's been one method that has been the one that has used, which is this. You need a super majority of Congress. That's 2/3 of both houses to say, we want to change this. So say we wanted to, let's pick an example of our constitutional amendment. So say we wanted to replace the Electoral College. We would need 2/3 of the House of Representatives, 2/3 of Congress. And they would together, that's called proposing it. And then that has to be ratified. Ratified is where another group will agree to the proposal of the other or disagree with the proposal of the other. Now, this is then done by 38 state legislatures. Now, why is 38 important? Because that's 3/4 of the state legislatures. So it has to go through all of Congress, that's both houses, and then through 3/4 of all 50 states to become an amendment to the Constitution. That's a big deal. That's going to take a long time, and it's relatively unlikely to be successful, at least on the first attempt. Here's another method. We're kind of playing with the same ideas here, but the idea is that it can be proposed in different areas and it can be ratified in different areas. And this happened once. You could get a supermajority of Congress, that's the same. And then instead of actually getting the state legislatures to do it, like the regional parliaments, if you like, it then is done by ratifying conventions. These are like kind of big events that people kind of get summoned to and they kind of vote when they kind of get there. Perhaps not a particular fact that you need to know, and the next two perhaps even less important because they've never actually happened. But it's important to know they exist because if you look at these two, you can see there's no mention of Congress or the federal government in any way. So let's say the federal government just went nuts, just for argument's sake. Let's say the president goes nuts and somehow Congress goes nuts at the same time and somehow they drag the judiciary with them. It is possible for the states to change the Constitution without the federal government's involvement. Think back to America. For Americans, freedom and opposing tyranny is very important. So you could do it with 2/3 of state legislatures proposing it, and then 3/4 of state legislatures could then ratify it. It's never happened, but it could happen. There have been occasions where there have been a number of state legislatures that have started proposing these constitutional amendments, and then normally what's happened is then Congress has then kind of picked that up and then proposed it themselves. So the threat of it is always there, and it has been moved towards, but it's never happened, that one. The fourth one is again just a variation on that similar theme. Next point to know is that constitutional amendments fail all the time. There's been a constitutional amendment to try and outlaw flag burning, setting fire to the American flag, and it's failed over and over again. In fact, it's been voted on at least 6 times since 1995, and it's not alone. There will be many, and there will continue to be many constitutional amendments that some people think is a good idea, but because the bar to get through is quite high, 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of state legislatures, you're going to need a significant majority, or to use the key phrase, a supermajority, to have any chance of getting through. Flag burning has made it through the House of Representatives, but it never made it through the Senate. And something like flag burning is more likely to succeed with a Republican House because of their views on tradition and nationality and national pride and things like that. So in order to get something through the houses, you're going to need bipartisanship. You're going to need the parties to work together, because the Republicans can't do it by themselves, unless for some reason you ended up with a House that was really shifted towards the Republicans or really shifted towards the Democrats. Normally you're going to need some bipartisanship to get this through. And again, all of this is deliberate. 2/3 is hard to get on purpose. It means that only constitutional amendments that the country is more or less as a whole saying, yeah, we want this, they're the only ones that are really going to get through, and that is by design. You shouldn't be able to accidentally or easily change the Constitution. Think about the UK system as an alternative with its uncodified, unentrenched Constitution. You just need a simple majority in one chamber and it's done, whereas here you need to have many houses or many legislatures, both at a national, federal level and at a state level, to get something through. There have been other amendments that have failed to get through that are worth mentioning at this stage as I try and control my PowerPoint. Firstly, scrapping the Electoral College in 2016. Remember how Hillary got more votes but she lost the presidency? There was a proposal, let's scrap the Electoral College. Didn't get anywhere. There's been a proposal to balance the budget, the idea that they shouldn't ever spend more than they take in terms of taxes, and that they shouldn't take in more than they intend to spend. That's been proposed as a constitutional amendment on numerous times, never got anywhere. Now here's one that's a bit more unique, the Equal Rights Act for men and women. Now you might be thinking, hang on a minute, don't women have equal rights already? They have the right to vote, but there's nothing constitutionally that says that both men and women must have equal rights. Now, there are individual statute laws that do this, but remember there is a difference between a constitutional law and a normal statute law. Some people very much believe you should put it into the Constitution. And in fact, it's made it through the House of Representatives, it's made it through the Senate, but it hasn't been ratified by 38 states. And this equal rights for men and women thing was originally written back in, I think, the 1920s. It eventually made it through Congress, I believe, in the 1940s. Check my dates on this. I'm not 100% on these. I looked it up earlier. And then it was ratified by 35 states, but it didn't get to 38. And then some states then unratified their initial approval, and then some of them have since re-ratified it. So it's kind of sitting in this weird limbo of, is it ratified? Is it not ratified? Now, they do put deadlines on these. They put a deadline in saying, well, it has to be done by, I think it was like 1980 or 1985 or something like that. But that deadline's not constitutional and enforceable. So if it got ratified, just for argument's sake, they put a deadline in. It hasn't made the deadline. But what if 38 states ratify it after the deadline? Is it then part of the Constitution or not? I don't know. Maybe there's a certain vagueness there that needs to be addressed. So there's some interesting examples for you to talk about. It's definitely worth you Googling that ERA, Equal Rights Act, to get a good grip on it. But if a constitutional amendment makes it through Congress, it's very likely to be ratified, because 27 out of 33 have gone through both. So 33 amendments have made it through Congress. Out of those 33, 27 have then made it through the state legislatures as well. So it's got a pretty good chance of going through if it makes it through the others. Of course, the ERA is one of the 6 that has not made it through. So what are some of the successful amendments? Well, I've already told you that there's 27 of them, but I'm not going to go through all of them, but I am going to give you some edited highlights. Just things that you can mention in an exam or refer to or discuss. First of all, amendments 1 to 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are collectively known as the Bill of Rights. I'm just going to tell you a couple of them in a bit more detail. Number 1, the first ever amendment is the right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all the kind of the frees, if you like, and that was amendment number 1. They knew it was going to be put in there. They knew it was going to be put in part of the Constitution. Like I say, the amendment process is deliberate and planned from the very start. But here's one that's caused a lot more difficulty, which is amendment number 2, still part of the Bill of Rights, which is the right to bear arms. A lot of people think this is a very important one to keep. A lot of people think this is one that really needs to go or be modified or changed. But it's very hard to amend the Constitution, because not only do you have to agree that it's wrong, you also have to agree what you're going to change it to, which is one of the reasons why this one has stuck, and it's been constitutionally defended by the judiciary and many party members. Skipping ahead now to the end of the Bill of Rights, number 10. Number 10 of the Bill of Rights says that powers are reserved. Now, what that means is, if the powers are not enumerated, as in specifically given to the federal government, then they are reserved to the states. So if the Constitution says the federal government can do this, then that belongs to the federal government. But if it doesn't mention it, or it doesn't mention it in terms of the federal government, then it belongs to the states. That means it's a reserved power. So this right is basically defending the rights of the state. To basically say, if it ain't in the Constitution, it ain't the federal government's responsibility, it's ours. Here's another one. Ending slavery, 13, bit of a Roman numeral there, 10 and then 3. So ending slavery, very famous one, very important one, civil rights, etc., etc. Here's the one that went wrong. 18, they banned alcohol. 1920s, 1930s, think Bugsy Malone, gangsters, all those kind of things. They banned alcohol. And then they decided they quite like to drink. And so Amendment 21, I think it is when they amended the amendment, and they brought it back. Now, this is an important one because A, it's quite memorable, it sticks in the head, but it's also made Americans very cautious about amending the Constitution, especially quickly. There's a very firm belief that you should only amend the Constitution when absolutely necessary, and this example is one of the reasons why. You can make a mistake, and then you're then stuck with something in the Constitution that you might not like. So sometimes maybe it's better to deal with what you've got rather than changing it to something new. Amendment number 22, 2-term limits. That means a president can only stand for election once, and then twice, and then no more. Which means Barack Obama can never stand for president of the United States ever again unless they change the Constitution. The man there, Roosevelt, he was president 4 times in a row, and so he was kind of the reason they put this constitutional amendment in, despite the fact that he was a popular president and most people would think he did a good job. It was felt that there should be a 2-term limit to prevent tyranny, to prevent kind of a dictatorship or one person having too much power. And the last one, perhaps not a very important one, but it's the most recent, so let's mention it. Number 27. Congress is no longer allowed to give itself a pay rise. The idea is about democratic accountability, not giving them too much power. They are allowed to give a pay rise to the next Congress, so they can vote to give themselves a pay rise. Then there must be an election, and after that election, the pay rise takes effect. It's about accountability, transparency, not kind of stealing money, all those kind of things. So there's a whole bunch of successful amendments that have made it through, and a little bit of the stories behind them. Now, why are amendments so rare? Why are there only 27? Why isn't there 100? Well, let's look at some of the reasons in a bit more detail. The first one is obvious. It's really difficult. I've mentioned this a few times, 2/3 and then 3/4. That's not easy to get. It's a deliberate, difficult process that is supposed to make amendments rare and only when absolutely necessary. For example, the abolition of slavery. The country had reached a point where they felt that this was something they wanted to change. It was out of date. They wanted to do it. Same with the votes of women. And these things were controversial. It wasn't like they sailed through, especially when you had certain states that were in favor and other states that weren't in favor. It's deliberately a difficult process that only goes through when possible. The other reason why amendments are rare is there's a special clause, article, that's become known the elastic clause because it's stretched. There's one that says that the federal government has the power to do anything which is necessary and proper, that phrase, necessary and proper, in order to fulfill its duties. So there's something that basically says the federal government has the power to do anything it needs to do to be able to do what it needs to do. And I'm deliberately overusing the word to do. But there's a phrasing which is deliberately vague. Do you remember how we've talked about in the principles of the Constitution about it being specific and vague? The elastic clause is a specific example of that the federal government has the power to do anything that is necessary and proper in order for it to do whatever it needs to do. So the federal government can kind of say, oh yeah, we actually have the power to do that. And there's something called the New Deal, which Roosevelt was responsible for, where this elastic clause was stretched and stretched, that we'll talk about in a future video. But that's one of the reasons why amendments are rare, is because sometimes the government hasn't needed to do a constitutional amendment to make a change. They've been able to do it by kind of using this elastic clause to say, actually, yeah, we do have that power. The next reason is judicial review. The Supreme Court over time has interpreted and perhaps twisted and perhaps changed the Constitution by using what they call judicial review. And the example here might be something like abortion. The right of a woman to have an abortion has effectively now become constitutional, but it doesn't ever mention that in the Constitution. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling that basically says, oh yeah, by the way, the Constitution says this or can be interpreted like this, that is effectively an amendment to the Constitution without going through that process. And that's one of the reasons why the Supreme Court in America is so much more powerful than the Supreme Court in the UK, because the Supreme Court is an unelected body that in many ways has the power to change the way the country is run, or the rules that are enforceable. And of course, we'll be looking at this in more detail in a future video. The other one is conservatism, possibly with a small c. I don't mean conservatives as in the Conservative Party. I mean tradition and keeping things the same and not adjusting things unless you absolutely have to. There is a feeling in much of America that you shouldn't just change things because you can or on a whim. You know, let's keep things the same. The country's been successful. So this is why amendments are so rare, or 4 clear reasons why amendments have been so rare. And lastly, on that conservatism one, you could expand that by talking about that alcohol one, the one that went wrong. You know, let's keep things the same because things can go wrong. So what's good and what's bad about this process? You can probably start to put this together yourself now and think, well, why, do I like this amendment process? Do I not like this amendment process? But let's spell it out. First of all, it protects from sudden surges in public opinion, which means if all of a sudden everyone feels that we should do this or change the Electoral College, the Constitution will slow you down. You've got to get it through both houses, which is going to take many years of elections. Then you've got to get it through all of these state legislatures, which again is going to take many years of elections and many ratifications and so on. Any change to the Constitution is going to be slow. So it protects from instant changes, knee-jerk reactions. Public opinion can change very quickly in times of, if there's a terrorist attack or some sort of key event, public opinion can change really fast. And this protects the Constitution from those quick reactions. It also protects from the tyranny of the majority. Just for example, if you ever had a situation where 52% of the country wanted something but 48 didn't, under this system, that's not enough. You'd need a far bigger majority to get something through. So it protects against a small majority being able to enforce its will over a large minority, if that's not a contradiction. The other strength of the process is when they have needed to change the Constitution, they have abolished slavery. They have given women the vote. They have stopped term limits. They have given protections to freedom of rights and freedom of religion. So you could make a clear argument that says, well, anytime they've needed to change it, it's got through. What's the problem? You also know that because it can go wrong, such as the alcohol one, that the process works because it stops these kind of quick amendments kind of going through unnecessarily. So the fact that it is difficult to change is a strength because it can go wrong. You can make that argument. It also protects the rights of individual states. Article 10, or sort of the Bill of Rights 10, the reserved powers, it protects the rights of states to be able to make their own decisions and have their own powers and so on and so forth. And lastly, the specificity and the vagueness of the Constitution has allowed the meaning of the Constitution to evolve over time, meaning that more formal amendments are rarely needed. Or to put it very, very bluntly, the elastic clause and judicial review have allowed smaller changes to take place without actually needing to go and redo the whole document or actually do a constitutional amendment. What do you think? What's the killer argument? Do you like this as a set of arguments? Do you think this process, by and large, has worked? Have you bought these arguments? Well, let's go the other way. What's not good about the process? Well, it's too complex. This is why we're stuck with the Electoral College. This is why we're stuck with the right to bear arms. Although if you're in favour of either of those things, maybe you'll argue this the other way. But there are things that they would like, many people would like to change about their country, but they can't because of these barriers that the supermajorities or the 3/4 of states things puts up. Maybe the ratification process is just too tricky or too complex. So, for example, the Equal Rights Act for men and women. It got through the federal government, but it's stuck. It can't quite get to the 38 states. Maybe that ratification bit needs adjustments, or maybe some clarification about whether deadlines are enforceable or not. Maybe actually the process doesn't work. Let's go back to the alcohol one for a minute. Well, disruptive amendments can still get through. This alcohol one did get through. So maybe actually the system doesn't protect them very well at all. I think that there's definitely an interesting paragraph to be written about the alcohol one, because you can say, well, this is the exception, this is why they don't amend it very often, but you can also say, well, they did get it through, so you can put bad amendments through. Depends how you want to argue it. Play with that example. Maybe small states are overrepresented. So the Senate, as you should know, has 2 members from every single state, regardless of population, which means that in theory, you could have Senate members from lots of smaller states overriding the bigger states. And then what if all of the 38 states that ratified this were the teeny tiny ones? And again, a big state like California or Texas, their Senate members hadn't agreed to it, their representatives hadn't agreed to it, and their legislature hadn't agreed to it. You could get it theoretically. I can't give you an example of where this has happened, but theoretically you could make an argument that if all of the smaller states got together, they're overrepresented because it only needs to get to 38. It doesn't specify which 38 it has to be or whether it has to be the bigger 38. You could get a situation where smaller states, small population states, are able to overrule the bigger ones. Maybe you could get a situation where you get a tyranny of the minority that are actually able to stand in the way of progress. If you've got, for example, 1/3 that are just saying, no, we really want to keep our guns, they can block it. The tyranny of the minority. You can make this argument that you could get a small group that are actually able to stand in the way of progress. And lastly, that Supreme Court one. The Supreme Court wields enormous power in America. And depending on your view of the Supreme Court, you can either argue this is a good thing because it's an independent and neutral judiciary that's able to make the judgments, or you can go the other way and say, who are these guys that keep changing the Constitution without being elected? And then you could bring in more recent examples such as the Brett Kavanaugh kind of application process and talk about how it's become partisan and political. And so you can make an argument here about the appropriateness of a Supreme Court being able to adjust the Constitution. So there you go. You should know from watching this video what an amendment is, how you amend it, some of the amendments that have been made and some of them that have failed, some of the little stories that go behind it, some of the strengths of the process, and some of the weaknesses of the process. Hope you find it useful. If I made any mistakes, then do let me know in the comment section or any other useful examples that I could use. If you like the video, then give it a like, and thank you.